Hello everybody and welcome back to another local history video. This week's story comes from Liff, which is a village just outside of Dundee. And while I might not be able to tell you the meaning of Liff, hopefully I can give you some interesting historical context and a wee legend that you won't have heard before. And to everybody that has just switched off because of that terrible pun, I don't blame you and I'm sorry. But the focus for sort of this legend and probably the most kind of historic site in Liff is a hill called Hurly Hawkin. And this is kind of a promontory jutting out between two streams of the Liff Burn. It's just to the west of where the parish church is. And this was obviously the sort of focus for early settlements in the Liff area. And there's remains of a prehistoric fort there. And there's also evidence that in the 1st or 2nd century AD, the prehistoric fort had been built over with a broch, which is a type of circular dry stone building that's often found in Scotland around this time period. And there's only traces remaining of the broch as well, but archaeologists have found pottery and metal goods there during excavations that show this was a kind of site of habitation for a while. And another feature at Hurly Hawkin is a souterrain dug into the ground. So if you've been following these videos for a few weeks, you'll already know all about souterrains from the Laird of Balmachy video. And if you've not, then you can go back to find out a wee bit more about souterrains in the Angus area there. So again, if you've been following, you probably know that archaeological sites like this are quite likely to have a wee legend or two attached to them. And this is also the case with Hurly Hawkin. And there's a story about a woman known as Meg o' Liff, and this was recorded in ballad or poem form by Arthur Dalgetty, who was a local doctor that had an interest in history and folklore of the area. He published a book on the church and parish of Liff in 1940. And the story goes that many years ago in the village of Liff, there lived a couple named John and Meg Ruff. And John was a weaver, and Meg, by all accounts, was a terror. And John worked hard like all weavers did, but she tormented him day and night to work harder. And she would say things that, he never wove as much cloth as their neighbours, and if he didn't try harder, they'd both starve, although they were really in no danger of that. And at one point, John had been working on a gigantic web. This is the weaving term for the pieces of cloth that they worked on all year. And by winter, it was nearly finished. So one Saturday he got up early and he worked by candlelight until the sun came up, and he was determined to get this finished that day. And he wove all day and into the evening, but finally the cloth was complete. And John sighed with relief, and he got up and he stretched and he sat down by the fireside, looking forward to a quiet evening with his old pipe for company. But of course, when Meg saw that he was not working, she stormed over and she demanded to know what he was doing. "Get back to your loom, you layabout." But John told her that he'd finished the web he'd been working on for months, and what's more, the morn was Sunday, surely he could have one evening off. But there was no telling her, and in her fury she smacked his old pipe from his hand and it shattered on the hearthstone. And John knew from long experience with Meg that there was no point in him arguing back. So he sat there in silence and prepared to weather another round of her ranting. But before Meg could get another insult out of her mouth, the clock struck 10, and with the chimes there came a banging on the door. And before either of them could go to answer it, the door was shoved open, and there stood a crowd of old hags. And they were dressed in shawls and rags, and they each had a broom in their hand, and they were cackling and shrieking and laughing. And they ran into the house, and they grabbed Meg by the arms and legs, and they dragged her out of the door and into the night. And they laughed all the way as they ran with her up to the top of Hurly Hawkin. And there they flung Meg onto the ground, and they tied her arms and legs up to keep her still, and they danced around her, chanting as they went. And then this black chair rose out of the top of the hill, and they tied Meg onto the chair, and they kept on chanting. And they chanted a wee rhyme that went, "We've got her new on Hurly Hawkin. What shall we do? Skelp her, nane will help her. Skelp her bare for temper bracken." And so the hags all lifted their brooms and they started to whack Meg with them over and over. And she tried to scream, but she found that her voice would just not come out. And as she sat there enduring this torture, she felt so sorry for herself. This suffering that she had to endure. Surely no one else had ever felt suffering like this. And as she sat there, it began to dawn on her that in fact, maybe this was a bit like the suffering that she had made John endure almost every day of their marriage. And she started to feel something that she had never felt before, and that was pity. And she began to regret the harsh words and the shouting. And soon the very first tears that she had ever shed began to drop from her eyes. And as soon as the hags saw this, they fell silent and they laid their brooms down. And they untied Meg, and the chair disappeared back into the top of the hill. And then they picked her up and carried her far more gently than before back down into the village. And instead of cackling and screaming, they were laughing kindly. As the village clock chimed midnight, they laid Meg back down into her bed and disappeared away back to the hills. Now the next morning, John could tell immediately that Meg was a changed woman. Instead of nagging him to get to work, her words were kind and her temper was much calmer. Now, John never asked what had happened that night, and Meg never told him. But from that day on, their house was a much more peaceful and a happier one. So the story of Meg of Liff is definitely one of those don't try this at home stories, but the moral of kindness and understanding is clear there.